would simply take it for the hypocrisy that it is. So Washington sheds crocodile tears for Darfur in the hopes that it will distract people from its own actions while gratefully welcoming the lobbying that they get from a Save Darfur establishment that is shockingly naive and credulous about the nature of our own government. As for the conflict, the mass slaughter is mostly over, but the justice for the victims still seems quite distant. There's some reason for optimism. There was a peace agreement that ended the very long-running North-South Civil War in 2005. It gives some hope and guidelines for possibly reaching a peace agreement in Darfur. But without an accurate understanding of the attitudes of the major powers towards Darfur, the roles in the conflict that they have played, we will be unable to effectively advocate for that just solution. Well, I hope this has been provocative and interesting. I'll leave it there. So, thank you.
Steve, back up here. What are the racial, tribal, linguistic, and religion differences dividing Darfur from the central Sudanese government?
Well, so unlike the north-south divide, in Darfur there's the north of the country, so the government and Darfur, they are all Muslims. But the people in the central part of Sudan, in the capital and so on, the government, they identify as Arab as well. I mean, to be clear, they don't look like they're Saudi Arabian, but they identify as Arab. While the people in Darfur, some of them identify as Arab, and some of them identify as African. It has a lot to do with what their mother tongue is and their cultural background and so on. I mean, if you look at people, you can't really tell. To Americans, they would all look like Black Africans, but some of them, there's kind of a split between tribes in Darfur that identify as Arab and those who identify as African. And it's actually a small percentage of the Arab identifying tribes have followed the government's lead and agreed to join militias, and that sort of gives them some advantage because then they raid villages of their neighboring tribes and can, steal the livestock and resources and so on. But that's what the government has used to play off one groups against each other in Darfur by encouraging a sort of Arab nationalism or a sense of pan-Arabism that they're better than the African identifying tribes.
There's a few that just follow the same theme, so let me just sort of bring these together. One was the U.S. CIA involved in the rise of revolutionaries in Darfur? And tied to that is, do you believe that the U.S. government's coverage of Darfur is news to distract us from issues that the country is actually a part of? In other words, is the CIA, the government, really getting involved in this to try and distract us from other things in the news?
Well, if you look online, you can find theories to that effect that the U.S. government is behind it all, or sometimes Israel, that they're doing something to, harm or foment the rebellion in Darfur. As far as I can tell, that there's not much to that. I mean, who knows? It could prove to be true. Maybe we'll get Washington's declassified records in 30 years and see that, yes, that was the case, but I've never seen too much that was credible that indicated that, and certainly whether there was any role of the CIA, it's largely based on sort of the indigenous dynamics in Darfur. So I don't think that it's as kind of nefarious as Washington creating the rebellion to distract. It's just sort of something that arose, and then it was a useful dynamic.
Do you believe that one of the reasons for our lack of action with funding and so forth from the United States is actually racism compared to Bosnia, Rwanda, or other places?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a theme or an idea that's put forward sometimes. The problem I have with that is that the celebrated case of humanitarian intervention by Washington was bombing Yugoslavia to help the Kosovars. Well, I mean, it wasn't humanitarian in effect because it was an ugly place before the NATO bombing campaign. This was in 1999. But it got much worse, so the Serbs sort of dramatically escalated their violence after the bombing started. And this was actually predicted by the NATO commander. So I don't see that as a humanitarian intervention or a case of helping the Kosovars. That said, it's always kind of hard to discount race as a factor in what conflicts people are paying attention to. But certainly many people actually have paid attention to Darfur. It's just, I think it's really about the government, for its own reasons, deciding to intervene in Kosovo, but not in Darfur. But it's that I don't think it's particularly race-based.
Staying with humanitarian intervention, you seem to find it incredible that the U.S. would engage in humanitarian interventions. What about Bosnia, Kosovo, Haiti, and Somalia?
Well, okay, I already talked about Kosovo. I won't go into more detail about that. Somalia was a case that actually I didn't mention in my book. By the way, I do have some copies here. I don't want to be a used car salesman, but if you are interested, I did bring some. But we went into some detail looking at a couple cases of UN peacekeeping forces and humanitarian interventions, cases that have been put forward as successes. Somalia is a very mixed story. I would say it's a failure, or at best a very mixed bag, not just because of what happened to the U.S. Marines who were shot down and dragged through the streets and so on, but also because of the humanitarian impact was, it saved some lives, but it also took some lives in other areas, so it's not really clear what the net effect was. But certainly it should have been done far better. I mean, the starvation that was happening in Somalia, the UN and US forces went in at the very end of the starvation, so they didn't have a big role to play in distributing food. But there's a lot to criticize about that intervention. Haiti is actually one case where, in fact, it's the only case I know of where the US intervention, in a narrow sense, was positive. So I'm talking about the intervention in under Bill Clinton when they went in to restore the Aristide government. They put all sorts of strictures on Aristide for him to come back. They said he had to follow all these neoliberal economic policies. So it was kind of making a deal with the devil, but it did get rid of the dictatorship that was very brutally ruling the country, and I think most Haitians were happy about it. So I think that was a legitimate case, but it's the only one. And we actually look at that in the book too. Then there are you can find a few perhaps more authentic cases of humanitarian intervention in history that don't involve the U.S. So, if you look at, say, West Bengal in 1971, or Vietnam, when Vietnam invaded Cambodia, those actually had clear humanitarian impacts. In all cases, I don't think it's actually motivated by humanitarian intervention, though. That's not how governments work. We'd have to have far more democratic forms of government for, governments aren't like charities or something. They're not moral organizations. They act on their interests.